Hello, today we introduce yet another new paper which is entitled as Introduction to Indian Philosophy, which is introduced to the UGCF NEP syllabus of the semester 1 students under the DSC 3 in University of Delhi from the Department of Philosophy. This paper is for the beginners and we try to introduce them to the various themes, concepts, debates, nuances that revolves around Indian philosophy. This is Professor Ananya Barua, Department of Philosophy, Hindu College, University of Delhi. Now, the first thing first, what is philosophy? Philosophy is often defined as the love of wisdom, but in practical terms, it means thinking deeply and carefully about fundamental questions of life. Unlike everyday thinking, philosophy does not accept things at face value. It asks, why is this true? How do I know this? Can this belief be questioned? Philosophy is not about memorizing answers. It is about learning how to question intelligently. So, the follow-up question that might strike all of us at this point is, what makes Indian philosophy unique? Now, let us move specifically to Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy shares many similarities with other traditions. It asks about truth, knowledge, and reality. But it has a distinctive feature that sets it apart. It is not just about knowing the truth, it is about living the truth. In many traditions, philosophy is primarily theoretical. In Indian philosophy, it is deeply practical. It asks, how can knowledge reduce suffering? How can understanding transform life? How can we attain peace or liberation, moksha? So, Indian philosophy is not just something you study, it is something you apply. If we are to talk about the central aim of Indian philosophy, we see that it is basically freedom from suffering. One of the most important ideas in Indian philosophy is this. Think about this carefully. Now, suffering may come from expectations, attachments, fear, ignorance. Indian philosophers were not satisfied with simply describing suffering. They wanted to solve it. That is why almost all Indian philosophical systems, whether Hindu, Buddhist or Jain, focuses on understanding the cause of suffering, finding a path to overcome it. This makes Indian philosophy deeply connected to life, psychology and ethics. Now, there are three main areas of study. Number one is knowledge, which is to do with epistemology. This deals with questions like, how do we know something? What counts as valid knowledge? For example, how do you know that this is a classroom? You might say, because I see it, because I experience it. This leads to discussions about perceptions, inference and reasoning. In Nyaya school, for example, it focuses heavily on this, analyzing how knowledge is formed and validated. Now, when we talk about reality or metaphysics, this deals with what is real, does the self exist, is the world permanent or changing? Different schools give different answers. Now, in Buddhism, there is the no permanent self or the anatmavad. In the Vedanta, it is the one ultimate reality or Brahman. In others, it is the different combinations of matter and consciousness. This diversity shows that Indian philosophy encourages multiple perspectives. What about ethics and life? Now, this area which basically asks how should we live, what is the right action. For example, the Bhagavad Gita teaches perform your duty. Do not be attached to results. This is not just theory, it is practical guidance for everyday life. The diversity of schools, we see that in Indian philosophy is not a single system. It is a rich collection of different viewpoints. Some important examples include in Nyaya, it is to do with logic and reasoning; Vedanta, ultimate reality and self; Buddhism, impermanence and no self; Charvaka, only matter is real. Each school disagrees with others but also contributes to a larger intellectual dialogue. This teaches an important lesson. Truth is not always simple. Sometimes it requires exploring different perspectives. So philosophy in everyday life. Now one might ask, is philosophy really relevant to my life? When, for example, we judge someone's emotions or decide what is right or wrong or question our beliefs or reflect on our actions, we are already doing philosophy. For example, if a friend smiles and you assume they are happy, but can you be completely sure? This simple question opens up deep philosophical inquiry about knowledge and perception. Now, in daily life, we often accept things quickly, we follow habits, we avoid questioning. Philosophy does the opposite. It slows down thinking. It questions assumptions. It demands justification. This makes philosophy both challenging and rewarding, and this is where there has been difference of philosophical thinking from ordinary thinking. Coming back to Indian philosophy, why should one even study Indian philosophy? Now, the most important question is, why should we study this subject? Is because number one, it develops critical thinking. You learn to question, analyze, and reason clearly. It helps in self-understanding. You begin to reflect on your own beliefs and identity. It provides emotional insight, which is understanding suffering helps in handling stress and confusion. It encourages open-mindedness. Different schools show that there are multiple ways of thinking. It connects knowledge with life. You don't just learn, you transform your perspective. So a deeper insight is, we can summarize the difference like this. Many philosophies ask, what is truth? Indian philosophy asks, what is true and how can it change my life? This is what makes it deeply meaningful. So when we bring it all together, we see that Indian philosophy begins with wonder, with everyday questions. It develops into systematic inquiry. It explores knowledge, reality, and ethics. It aims at reducing suffering, encourages practical transformation. It is both intellectual and experiential. So, what is one belief that we have always accepted without questioning? Philosophy begins the moment we start examining that belief. Now, the very basic question, philosophy thus is concerned with the search for truth and understanding reality. Many philosophical traditions primarily focuses on theoretical questions such as what exists, what is knowledge, what is truth. However, Indian philosophy distinguishes itself by extending this inquiry beyond mere intellectual understanding. It not only asks what is truth, but also how can truth transform human life. This practical orientation makes Indian philosophy deeply relevant. In this truth as transformation, many traditions, truth is treated as an object of knowledge to be analyzed and understood intellectually. In contrast, Indian philosophy regards truth as something to be realized and lived. Knowledge is not complete unless it leads to a transformation in one's life. For instance, recognizing that attachment leads to suffering is not sufficient. One must cultivate detachment in practice. Similarly, in Buddhist thought, understanding impermanence, anitya, requires direct experiential realization, not merely conceptual acceptance. Thus, truth in Indian philosophy has a practical and transformative dimension. Now, from everyday questions to systematic inquiry is where Indian philosophy focuses on. Indian philosophy begins with everyday human concerns, suffering, identity, moral dilemmas. These simple questions are then developed into systematic and rigorous philosophical systems. For example, the Nyaya school analyzes the nature of knowledge and valid reasoning, while Vedanta explores the ultimate nature of reality. This shows that Indian philosophy combines accessibility with intellectual rigor, moving from ordinary experience to structured inquiry. Now, when we talk about the comprehensive scope, knowledge, reality, and ethics, Indian philosophy encompasses three major domains. Epistemology is the knowledge domain. How do we know what is true? Metaphysics is reality. What is the nature of the world and the self? Ethics is life. How should we act to achieve a good life? This integrated approach ensures that philosophy is not fragmented but holistic, addressing all aspects of human existence. A central feature of Indian philosophy is the aim of reducing suffering or overcoming suffering. Unlike purely theoretical systems, it seeks practical solutions to life's problems. In Bhagavad Gita, emphasizing about performing one's duty without attachment to results, while Buddhism identifies desire as the root of sufferings and prescribes the Eightfold Path as a remedy. Thus, philosophy becomes a guide to achieving inner peace and liberation. Indian philosophy is both intellectual and experiential. On the one hand, it involves logical reasoning, debate, and conceptual analysis. On the other hand, it emphasizes personal experience, meditation, and ethical practice. This dual nature ensures that philosophical insights are not merely theoretical but are verified through lived experience, leading to genuine transformation. Thus, we see that Indian philosophy stands out for its practical orientation. It goes beyond the theoretical question of truth to explore how truth can rather transform human life. Beginning with everyday questions, it develops into systematic inquiry covering knowledge, covering reality and ethics with the ultimate aim of reducing suffering. By combining intellectual rigor with experiential realization, Indian philosophy offers not just knowledge but a path to meaningful and fulfilled living. So remember, Indian philosophy is just not about understanding the world, it is about understanding yourself and learning how to live wisely within the world. So if at this point someone asks us that critically, how do you then distinguish the features of Indian philosophy? We would primarily say that in Indian philosophy, which is rich and diverse tradition concerned with knowledge, reality and human life, it shares universal philosophical concerns. It is often regarded as distinctive due to its practical, spiritual and integrative approach. These distinctive features are: number one, practical orientation. Indian philosophy aims at solving the problem of suffering and attaining liberation, moksha. While practical orientation is valuable, some schools like Nyaya are highly theoretical, showing that not all Indian philosophy is purely practical. Number two, or the distinctive feature of Indian philosophy, secondly, is about the spiritual and ethical emphasis. It focuses on moral values such as truth, non-violence, and self-discipline. This can, however, sometimes lead to philosophy being seen as religious rather than rational, though many schools maintain strong logical rigor. Number three, the distinctive feature is integration of theory and practice. Knowledge must be realized in life, not just understood. This integration is a strength, but it may blur the line between philosophy and spirituality. The distinctive feature of Indian philosophy is about pluralism. Multiple schools with different perspectives coexist. Critically, however, pluralism encourages debate, but can also lead to contradictions without clear resolution. Number five, liberation as ultimate goal. Philosophy aims at freedom from suffering. However, this focus may limit inquiry into purely theoretical or scientific questions. So, Indian philosophy is distinctive due to practical and transformative orientation, but it also includes rigorous intellectual traditions. Its uniqueness in combining theory with life through this integration invites both strengths and limitations. Now going ahead, now that we understand the distinctive features of Indian philosophy, there could be certain follow-up questions for a young enthusiast. Questions like, is Indian philosophy primarily practical rather than theoretical? We must understand that Indian philosophy is often described as practical because it aims at liberation and the removal of suffering. However, it also contains heavily developed and highly theoretical systems. For example, in the arguments supporting practical nature, we find the focus on liberation, where the central aim has been about moksha or nirvana. Philosophy guides life, not just thought. In the ethical orientation, it emphasizes on conduct, discipline, and self-control. Experiential knowledge, truth must be realized through experience. However, there are certain arguments that support theoretical nature. Number one, the logical systems. Nyaya develops complex epistemology. Number two, metaphysical inquiry. Vedanta explores nature of reality in depth. Debate and analysis, strong traditions of argumentation and criticism. Critical evaluation, Indian philosophy is not purely practical. So, which means Indian philosophy is not purely practical because it combines theoretical reasoning, also practical application. At best, it is better understood, Indian philosophy is better understood as a synthesis of theory and practice. Indian philosophy thus cannot be reduced to either practical or theoretical frameworks. Its strength lies in integrating both, making it intellectually rich and practically meaningful. Now, if we are to pick up the concept of Pramana in Indian philosophy, we see that it is one of the most insightful concepts in our Bharatiya Darshana. Pramana refers to the means of valid knowledge and is central to Indian philosophy or Bharatiya Darshana. The different schools that accept different pramans, for example, Pratyaksha, we have Anuman, Upaman, Shabda, and these establishes validity of knowledge, distinguishes truth from error, provides methodological clarity. The strength is that this systematic classification of knowledge sources recognizes multiple ways of knowing. It encourages logical reasoning. However, there are limitations too. Disagreements among schools. Buddhism accepts only 2 pramanas, others accept more. There is also the reliability issues. Testimony may be biased, perception can be misleading. There can also be overlapping between pramanas. Some can be reduced to others. Thus, this very significant concept called the Pramana theory is a powerful epistemological tool, but differences among schools and limitations in application show that it is not without challenges. Now we come to the other significant questions of Indian philosophy about its relevance in contemporary life and a critical evaluation if we are to give any. We must understand that Indian philosophy, though ancient, continues to be relevant in modern life due to its focus on human well-being and ethical living. Its relevance can be seen in mental health that helps in mental stress and anxiety, ethical guidance that promotes values like non-violence and truth, self-awareness, encourages reflection and mindfulness, global influence, yoga and meditation widely practiced. The critical if we look at the strength, we see that Indian philosophy provides practical solution to modern problems, encourages holistic development. However, some ideas may not align with modern scientific thinking. There is a risk of misinterpretation or oversimplification. Thus, Indian philosophy remains highly relevant, but its application requires critical understanding and adaptation to modern contexts. Now, one of the recurring questions that could come up to our young enthusiasts of Indian philosophy is Indian philosophy essentially spiritual in nature, and that's about it? Let us try to understand. Indian philosophy is often discussed as being spiritual due to its focus on liberation and inner realization. Many argue that it emphasizes on moksha, focuses on inner experience, integration with religious traditions. However, there are also certain counter-arguments where they say that there are this presence of rational schools like Nyayavad, materialist schools like Charvaka. So there is a very strong logical and analytical traditions. Indian philosophy thus includes both spiritual elements and rational inquiry. It is not exclusively spiritual, for we must understand that while spirituality is an important aspect, Indian philosophy is a balanced tradition combining spiritual insight with rational analysis. We must also thus understand that to break it down, Indian philosophy is basically about knowing plus transformation. Western philosophy, on the other hand, is about knowing or know plus analyze. So, while Western philosophy primarily emphasizes rational analysis and theoretical knowledge, Indian philosophy integrates intellectual inquiry with practical transformation, aiming at liberation and inner peace. So, to quickly wrap up what we have so far done, we see that in the Oriental, as much as there is knowledge, as is the case with Occidental, the two differ in the second part. In Indian philosophy, it is largely to do with transformation, and with knowledge, transformation comes only when there is a change not only from the outside world but also a change from the inner world. Thus, Indian philosophy had always attempted to talk about drishti or the vision that goes beyond just traditional wisdom. On the other hand, Western philosophy is all about know or knowledge plus analyze. Now, analyze is to have just a critical bent of mind. Analyze is to just have a justification, a true belief. But in Indian philosophy, we go beyond the superficial level of simple analyzation, simple justification, and simple what we call in epistemology as justified true belief. In Indian philosophy, primarily what the focus has been on is on integrating intellectual inquiry with practical transformation. For liberation and inner peace have had been a definite way out. On the other hand, Western philosophy primarily emphasizes on rational analysis and theoretical knowledge. For we must understand that in Western philosophy, moksha or liberation is not as significant as in Indian philosophy. Thus, to conclude, we can say that Indian philosophy, as much as it includes spiritual elements, it also includes rational inquiry. It isn't to say that spiritual elements and rational inquiry are exclusive, mutually exclusive to each other. While spirituality is an important aspect of Indian philosophy, it is just not an imbalanced approach. It has to be an integrated, a holistic, a balanced tradition combining spiritual insight with rational analysis that makes Indian philosophy stand out. And for this, as much as there are philosophers like the schools of Nyaya and the materialist schools like Charvaka, there are also schools that counter-argue this. So all in all, Indian philosophy is often described as spiritual due to its focus on liberation and inner realization, but we have just about discussed that it is a combination of spirituality and rational analysis. Thus, Indian philosophy provides practical solutions to modern problems, but also it tackles deeply with some of the core existential issues which are highly relevant, practical, and it also requires critical understanding and adaptation to modern contexts. Thank you so much.